Hello and welcome to 7 Days of Science. In the headlines this week, scientists have calculated the maximum possible size that T-Rex could have reached, a new species of Tyrannosaur has been discovered in Asia, we interviewed paleontologists on a recent discovery of another new dinosaur species, and much more. First up in the news this week, scientists have discovered something very intriguing called dark oxygen. Oxygen that is being produced at vast depths in the ocean. Approximately half the oxygen we breathe is produced in the ocean, and it was thought that it was only given off by marine plants during the process of photosynthesis, which they need light for. However, it turns out that oxygen is actually being produced on the deep sea floor where it is completely dark, in areas that contain potato-sized metal nodules. These nodules take millions of years to form from dissolved metals in the seawater, which collect on fragments of shells or other bits of debris. The nodules seem to be acting like batteries. When they are in contact with each other, they produce a current, and this current then splits seawater into oxygen and hydrogen. The discovery was made in an area of the deep sea between Hawaii and Mexico called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. It is this area that seabed mining companies have been exploring with the aim of collecting nodules to make, among other things, car batteries and wind turbines. This is yet another reason why further research into the consequences of deep-sea mining needs to be carried out before mining companies strip the seabed of these precious nodules and devastate an ecosystem we know very little about. Also in the news this week, some incredibly exciting findings have been made on Mars, as the Perseverance rover has sent back some images of Martian rocks that possibly hint at the presence of fossilized life. The image shows a section from an ancient riverbed in the Jezero crater, which formed during Mars's much wetter past. On either side of the photo are these white calcium sulfate veins, and between them a reddish band of hematite, but it's the small white spots surrounded by black halos within the red band that have caught the attention of scientists. These so-called leopard spots can form in earth rocks due to chemical reactions with hematite that release iron and phosphate, and this can be an energy source for microbes on Earth. In fact, when such spots are found in earth rocks, they are often associated with fossilized microbes in the subsurface. This rock, nicknamed Chasei Falls, was actually first detected by the rover as it had picked up signs of organic compounds in it, and now the discovery of the spots makes things very interesting. However, without returning a sample of the rock back to Earth, it will be hard to tell how the spots formed. It's incredibly exciting to think that there could be fossilized Martian life in there though. It's been another action-packed week for the paleontology news back on Earth, starting off with the naming of a new species of Tyrannosaur from China. It's been named Asiatyrannus zhui, and it lived at the very end of the Cretaceous period 66.7 million years ago. It's known from a partial skeleton including a nearly complete skull, pieces of the hind limbs, and vertebrae from the tail. This was a small to medium-sized tyrannosaur, likely measuring between 3.5 to 4 meters in length, although the individual that's been discovered was not quite finished growing at the time of death. Very interestingly, Asiatyrannus was uncovered from the same geological formation that another tyrannosaur was found in, the long-snouted Qianzhusaurus, or Pinocchio rex as it was nicknamed, described a decade ago in 2014. Qianzhusaurus, known from a specimen that was at about the same growth stage as Asiatyrannus when it died, was much larger at around 6.3 meters in length. The difference in skull shape between these two tyrannosaurs is also very intriguing, as Asiatyrannus has a deep snout compared to the elongated snout of Qianzhusaurus, suggesting they were occupying different ecological niches and feeding on different things to avoid competing with one another, with Qianzhusaurus as the apex predator of the ecosystem, while Asiatyrannus was a mesopredator. An incredible new discovery. A second new species of dinosaur has been named this week as well, a new kind of troodontid dinosaur from Japan. It lived between 112 and 106 million years ago and is named Hypnovenator matsubaraetoheorum, with Hypnovenator translating as sleep hunter. This refers to the fact that the fossil, which comprises tailbones, ribs, and parts of the hind limbs and left forelimb, is preserved in a sleeping posture, with the arm and ankles being folded in a similar way to how other more complete specimens of troodontids have previously been discovered. These other finds have typically been made in deposits that indicate the dinosaurs were rapidly buried by volcanic events or sandstorms. However, Hypnovenator appears to have been buried in muddy sands that was moved by a low-energy water flow. Hypnovenator is also significant for being the oldest and one of the earliest branching members of the troodontid subfamily Troodontinae. providing insight into the early evolution of this grouping of dinosaurs. Another wonderful dinosaur discovery this week then. We've got another very intriguing dinosaur discovery published this week as well, as researchers suggest that the iconic Tyrannosaurus rex could actually have grown to be significantly larger than our current body size estimates indicate. The paleontologists discuss how sampling the fossil record always presents challenges when it comes to working out the maximum size of any extinct animal, since it's a very incomplete record when we consider how many individuals of a given species must have lived and never fossilized. Even in living animals, it's still difficult to sample the extremes of body size in a species, as very few individuals will actually be at these extremes. So when considering the body size estimates for the most famous dinosaur of all, T-Rex, we almost certainly do not have the fossils of the biggest individual that ever existed. Therefore, these paleontologists have computationally generated a population of 140 million T-Rex individuals and modelled how they might realistically vary about a growth curve. T-Rex is a pretty good example to use for this, as it's not only very famous, but for a dinosaur, we do actually have quite a few skeletons of this species. About 84 reasonably complete ones, in fact, including private specimens. However, considering that an estimated 2.5 billion T-Rex lived over the course of the species' existence, we really haven't sampled very many. So what do these models find? Well, it turns out that the chances of us having found the 99th percentile in terms of body mass are actually surprisingly good, but the 99.99th percentile, where the truly gigantic individuals would sit, has almost certainly not been found yet, and they suggest that it will be a long time before such giants are discovered, if they ever are. So how big could the hypothetically largest tyrannosaurs ever have been? The researchers suggest that they could have been about 70% more massive than the currently known largest specimen, an individual known as Scotty, suggesting it could have reached around 15,000 kilograms compared to Scotty's 8,800 kilograms. This giant may also have been more than 15 meters in total length, again beating the most complete known specimen called Sue at 12 meters. It's a very interesting study that does of course also apply to species other than T-Rex, and the researchers again point out that although this hypothetical largest Tyrannosaurus probably did exist at some point in time, we almost certainly will never find it as a fossil. Next up, we spoke to paleontologist Dr. Jeremy Lockwood and Professor Dave Martill about a recent dinosaur discovery made on the Isle of Wight, the UK's dinosaur island. Jeremy and Dave, along with Dr. Susanna Maidment from the Natural History Museum in London, described a new species of large-bodied herbivorous iguanodontian dinosaur from the island. So Jeremy and Dave, where are we right now?
Well, we're at the site where two complete dinosaurs have been found, a Valdosaurus, but in 2013 we're at the site of where we excavated Comptonatus chasei. So this was found by a collector from the island called Nick Chase, and I was lucky enough to be invited along to the excavation to what turned out to be the most complete iguanodontian dinosaur, indeed the most complete dinosaur found in the UK over the last 100 years. And behind me is halfway up the cliff is where we actually found it.
So Dave, could you briefly explain what is an iguanodontian dinosaur?
Yeah, well, there's lots of different types of dinosaurs, but broadly we divide them into the meat-eating theropods, the big elephantine, long-tailed, long-necked sauropods, and a group which we call the ornithischians, or the bird-hipped dinosaurs. And that group contains several different types: stegosaurs, ankylosaurs, triceratopsians, but a group which we call the ornithopods. And these are animals that were pretty massive, mostly. They were amongst the earliest dinosaurs to ever be described. Gideon Mantell in 1824 described iguanodon from Sussex, and they had massive big back legs, somewhat shorter forelimbs, rather massive, almost horse-like skulls. They could walk on two legs, mostly, and we find the footprints here of those, and sometimes they would be walking on four legs, and just occasionally we find the handprints. And these dinosaurs were pretty widespread around the world, but they have not been studied here on the Isle of Wight in any detail until Jeremy came along and started to have another look at them.
What's the name of this dinosaur and why was this name chosen?
It's called Comptonatus chasei. So the species name, chasei, was named after Nick Chase, who was a phenomenal collector, a tremendous nose for sniffing out bones along this coast, and gave virtually everything to either the local museum here, Dinosaur Isle, or to the Natural History Museum. And so it seemed, unfortunately, he died just before COVID broke out. I mean, I collected with him and had hoped to collect with him for many years to come, but sadly he died. So he's never had a dinosaur named after him, so it seemed very appropriate to name this one after him. The first name, Compton, we're on Compton Bay, and Tonatus means thundered. And I think when we go further down this coast, we can find huge areas of footprints of very similar animals to this. And it does look like they were in herds, family groups, and although they're not the biggest of the dinosaurs, they're probably as big as an American bison, a male American bison. So I think if they were spooked by theropods, their main form of defense would be either charging or trying to run off or stampeding, much as you see in sort of cattle today. And bison are always described as thundering across the plains. So I was sort of echoing that maybe these dinosaurs were thundering along Compton all those years ago.
So Dave, what sort of environment would they have been living in?
The strata here are quite varied, but all of the strata in which the dinosaurs are found were laid down in a river system. Now, river systems have got lots of different environments. There's the floodplain of the river, there's the river channels, there are the sandbanks, and on that river floodplain there'd have been forests. And so it's very difficult to say exactly which of those environments they were in. They were almost certainly on the floodplain, they were almost certainly feeding on the vegetation, riparian vegetation on the riverbanks, and maybe in some of the forests that are on the floodplain. But where we find their remains are in the floods that washed onto the floodplain. So this animal and most of the other dinosaurs that we find here are found in flood deposits. We call them plant debris beds because there's a lot of fossil plant material, twigs, logs, huge logs sometimes, and we find their remains in these flood events. Now, it may be the case that these dinosaurs drowned in those flood events and were washed further down the river system, but it may also be the case that there were desiccated carcasses lying on the riverbanks and that they were then moved along by these floods. So sometimes you have to pay a lot of attention to exactly what the layout is of the bones when you find them in order to be quite precise about where the animal was exactly living. But mostly let's just think of a nice big river system, perhaps like the Congo River in Africa, and that these animals were living on the riparian vegetation along these river systems.
So Jeremy, how much of the skeleton has been found?
Well, if we include all the bones, including the skull bones, so we've got the skull, we've got limbs, nearly all of the spine, the axial skeleton, and we've got the brain case of this animal, which is really lovely. So I think if you count every bone, we've got about 149 different bones in there, and probably 160 if we count the ones that are replicated on either side. So that's really a vast amount of material.
Why is the discovery of this dinosaur so important for working out iguanodontian evolution and the diversity at this time?
Well, the earlier iguanodontians from the late Jurassic were much smaller animals, much more bipedal, and as we go into the late Cretaceous, we had the hadrosaurids, which very famously found in America, like Parasaurolophus, and these were really big animals. So this was a sort of transition area, and the early Cretaceous is not that well represented in the fossil records throughout the world. So this is one of the hotspots for finding these. One of the problems we've had is that a lot of the stuff is very fragmentary. So to actually get a complete animal tells us an awful lot about this animal. And we've got about maybe 5 or 6 million years of sediments along here. So this is really useful because we've got Mantellisaurus in the early Aptian, and this was a much earlier dinosaur. So both of those are almost complete, and this is the starting point to really look at, were these animals evolving here, or were there just a wider diversity than we presumed before? I mean, there was even talk that there might have been a sort of mass extinction event at the end of the Jurassic. So it's trying to iron out all those problems that this specimen is so useful for doing.
And so do you think that there are going to be more iguanodontians discovered from here?
Well, I think so. We've already got some in museums which have all been categorised as Mantellisaurus atherfieldensis, even though they cover a vast period of time. So I think, you know, we're sort of continuing to look through these things, but the more animals we find, the more autapomorphies or specific features on them that distinguish them from the others we're finding. So there are others in the museum that look similar to some of these new species. So the next thing is to start looking at those. It would help, of course, if we knew the stratigraphy better.
Yeah. I mean, in your study, I mean, you weren't just studying this dinosaur, you were studying all of the iguanodontians, or so-called iguanodontians, that were on in various collections in London, on the Isle of Wight and various places. And you revealed that actually there isn't just two, Mantellisaurus and Iguanodon, and the little Hypsilophodon, of course, but actually that there were really many different types. And then you start to think about, well, what would a river system today be like? What sort of animals would be, what herbivores would be on a river system today? And if you take some of the bigger river systems in larger continents, like Africa, for example, I mean, they're just dotted with lots and lots of herbivores, and hundreds of them, sometimes in herds that are thousands of animals strong, think wildebeest, but think of all of the other herbivores that are out on those plains. There are several species of zebra, there are giraffes, there are hippopotami, there's all sorts of animals there. And so you think to yourself, I wonder if Cretaceous river systems had similar diversity, but not in mammals, instead in dinosaurs. And I think Jeremy started to reveal that that probably is the case.
So Jeremy, you've had a very interesting journey into the science of paleontology. As a retired GP, you decided to pursue a PhD in the science. We get a lot of comments from people who say that they wish they'd gone into paleontology, but they feel like it's too late, they've done other careers now. But obviously you show that you know, you can always get into paleontology. So what would be your advice for people in that sort of situation?
Well, I was interested as a boy in paleontology, and I'm old enough to, when I was a boy, this was before dinomania had hit, so I was a bit of a peculiar individual, a friend of ours and that, and we lived where there were Silurian deposits, so we weren't going to find any dinosaurs, but the trilobite was the main thing that we were looking for. That was our great goal. But I studied medicine, and I learnt a lot of anatomy in medicine, and I was confused with the bones. We used to come here with the children when they were young. You found bones that were the same bone, but there were lots of differences with them. And you know, with human skeletons, which I'm very familiar with, you know, everything looks about the same. If you open up Cunningham's or Gray's Anatomy, it looks exactly like the picture there. So I was concerned that maybe some things were being overlooked. Obviously there's ontogeny, how old they were, and distortion is a major problem in paleontology. So I thought it would be a nice idea to do a PhD, and very kindly Dave allowed me to join the University of Portsmouth to study that. And it was really quite an adventure. And I think I would say to people who were maybe later thinking about something to do, I mean, if you're studying quantum physics, you've got very little chance to suddenly become expert and find something really new and extraordinary. But just walking along the beaches, we find bones which really could be new animals, they could be something different. These aren't all just dinosaurs, of course. Other tetrapods and mollusks and crustacea, they're all there, and a lot of it hasn't been investigated. So there's lots of windows of opportunity just from a taxonomic point of view, but trying to understand how these animals lived and trying to recreate the ecosystem that was here. It was clearly a vast and diverse ecosystem. So there's an enormous amount that people can contribute to science at any stage in their life, I think, with paleontology.
Yeah, you've got to remember that also the Isle of Wight is a holiday destination, and every year hundreds and hundreds of people come here and hope that they're going to maybe find a few fossils while they're on the beach. And on two occasions since I've been at Portsmouth, children have discovered new species of pterodactyl on the Isle of Wight. One was discovered at Atherfield Point, and another was discovered at Sandown Bay. The one at Sandown Bay was eventually called Colchicephalus.
After the
Colchicephalus, after the
Isle of
colcheads,
Wight.
which is a native of the Isle of Wight, is called a colchead. And so Colchicephalus was discovered by a 7-year-old boy. And then there was a young lady, Daisy Morris, who discovered, I think it was probably a tapijarid, one of these bizarre crested pterosaurs. So that just goes to show that anybody can make a contribution, whether you're a highly skilled professional such as Jeremy in the world of medicine, or if you're a child. Maybe the children stand a better chance because their eyes are closer to the ground.
The children, are much better than me. My eyes are failing a little bit now, so it takes longer to spot things, and they're closer to the ground than me. So, they can be very useful when you're looking. It's worth mentioning that out of all the dinosaur species, and it's difficult to put an exact number on that on the Isle of Wight, it's probably about 30, but some of them are very fragmentary material that was found by Victorians and named. But every single one was found by an amateur collector. Not a single one has been found by a professional paleontologist.
So that absolutely shows the role of the amateur, or even the casual collector, is actually paramount to paleontology.
Thank you again to Jeremy and Dave for doing this interview with us, and it's another fantastic dinosaur discovery from the Dinosaur Island. Next up in the news, a controversial study has been published in the journal Precambrian Research that has presented evidence for complex life beginning on Earth much earlier than previously thought. It's currently generally thought that complex animal life began around 635 million years ago. This study puts the beginning of complex life at 2.1 billion years ago. That's 1.5 billion years before the current more accepted timeframe. The study says that the widely accepted idea that nutrient limitation made it basically impossible for life to form until 635 million years ago could be marked at the wrong point, and they propose that their evidence shows that the right conditions for complex life existed long before. Interestingly, the study says that their complex life forms are not the ancestors to those that followed, that they were restricted to an inland sea and did not spread out across the globe, eventually dying out before they could evolve further. By proposing that complex life originated at least twice on seemingly independent occasions, the researchers are suggesting that this is not a ridiculously uncommon occurrence, which would suggest that if single-celled life was on other planets, it would be much more possible for it to evolve further. This study hasn't been accepted with open arms, however, and many in the scientific community remain unconvinced by the research. Even some of those who do agree with the study's conclusions say that more research has to be done and more evidence found to have these hypotheses more widely accepted. And finally for the news this week, paleontologists have discovered a new species of very early vertebrate relative that lived over 500 million years ago and was uncovered from rocks in Utah. It's named Nuucichthys rhynchocephalus, and the formation it was found in is one of only a few formations dating back to the Cambrian period that reveals the diversity of soft-bodied animals living at this time. Nuucichthys was a small torpedo-shaped creature lacking fins and with a snout-like front end that bore relatively large sideways-facing eyes. It probably had limited swimming abilities due to the lack of fins, and so it may have lived high up in the water column, drifting about in currents and suspension feeding. Another fascinating addition to our understanding of how vertebrates first evolved. Well, that's it for the news this week. I hope you've enjoyed learning about everything that's happened in these last 7 days of science. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Benji Thomas if you'd like, for more short-form videos about science news and extinct animals, and for updates from me and the 7 Days of Science crew. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.